Did you know that in the 1970s Soviet Union, a simple cookie could be a work of art, and a cake could have 10 or more layers? These weren't just desserts, they were symbols of celebration in a world of simplicity. Let's rediscover 20 of these forgotten sweets. You'll be stunned to learn how one of them became a nationwide sensation thanks to a government mistake. 1. Puchtitya Mukhlako. The name of this cake translates to bird's milk cake. In old stories, bird's milk was a magical food, something impossible to find that could bring you great happiness. And honestly, taking a bite of this cake feels pretty close to that. It's not a heavy, dense cake at all. Instead, it's a light, fluffy soufflé, almost like a solid mousse or a very firm marshmallow that's sandwiched between two thin layers of sponge cake and then covered in a layer of dark chocolate. It's a texture explosion in your mouth. The thing nobody tells you is that this cake has a wild history. While similar treats existed before, the official recipe was invented in the 1970s by a group of master pastry chefs in Moscow, led by a man named Vladimir Goralnik at the famous Praga restaurant. The government actually owned the recipe, and it became the first cake in the Soviet Union to get an official patent. It was so popular that people would wait in line for hours, sometimes all day, just to buy one. The recipe was a closely guarded secret, but that didn't stop home cooks from trying to copy it, leading to countless family versions. This dessert was a true luxury, a sign of a special occasion. Its cloud-like texture was unlike anything else. But while this cake was light as air, the next dessert on our list is its total opposite, a dense and sticky treat made from layers of pure honey goodness. 2. Medovik. If you love the taste of honey, then Medovik would be your dream cake. This isn't just a cake with a little bit of honey flavor. No, honey is the main star here. A Medovik is a layer cake, but we're not talking about 2 or 3 layers. A proper Medovik can have anywhere from 8 to 12 super thin cookie-like layers. Each layer is baked until it's golden brown, and then it's stacked with a creamy, tangy frosting. The secret ingredient that makes the frosting so special is sour cream, or sometimes a mix of sour cream and boiled condensed milk. It sounds strange, but the tang of the sour cream cuts through the sweetness of the honey perfectly. What's really incredible is how old this recipe is. Legend says the first Medovik was made in the 1820s for the wife of a Russian emperor, Alexander I. The empress supposedly disliked honey, but a clever young chef made this cake for her without telling her what was in it. She loved it, and a royal dessert was born. By the 1970s, it was a staple in every Soviet household. The cake layers start out crispy, but as they sit with the frosting for a day or two in the fridge, they absorb the moisture and become incredibly soft and tender. It's a cake that takes a lot of patience to make, but the result is a rich, complex flavor that is hard to forget. From a dessert fit for an empress, we move to one with a very formal international name, but a surprisingly simple and chocolatey heart. 3. Praga cake. Don't let the name fool you. The Praga cake has nothing to do with the city of Prague in the Czech Republic. This is a 100% Moscow creation, and it's another masterpiece from the same restaurant that gave us the bird's milk cake. The chef, Vladimir Goralnik, actually did study his craft in Czechoslovakia, so he named his creation in honor of his teachers. This cake became the Soviet answer to the world-famous Sacher Torte from Vienna. It's a serious chocolate lover's dream. It features dense, rich chocolate sponge cake layers. What makes it special is the filling. The frosting between the layers is a buttery chocolate cream made with condensed milk and cocoa powder. To give it a little fruity kick, the whole cake is often coated in a thin layer of apricot jam before being covered in a shiny, dark chocolate ganache. The apricot adds a little tartness that makes the deep chocolate flavor pop even more. You see, getting high-quality cocoa was not always easy, so chefs learned to make the most of what they had, and the result was this unforgettable, rich dessert. It was considered very elegant and was often the centerpiece at fancy parties and holiday dinners. This cake was a dark, sophisticated treat, but not all Soviet desserts were so formal. The next one is a rustic, messy, and incredibly fun treat that's all about fried dough and sticky honey. 4. Choc Choc. Now this is a dessert that is as fun to eat as it is to say. Choc Choc is not a cake or a cookie in the traditional sense. It's more like a sweet sculpture. It's made from little pieces of unleavened dough, about the size of a hazelnut or a small noodle, which are deep fried until they are puffy and golden. Then, while they are still warm, they are all mixed together with a hot, bubbling honey syrup. The whole sticky mixture is then piled onto a plate, often in the shape of a mound or a pyramid, and left to cool and harden. This treat comes from the Tatar and Bashkir regions, but it became popular all over the Soviet Union. It's a very communal dessert. You don't usually cut it with a knife. Instead, people just break off pieces with their hands. It's crunchy, chewy, and sticky all at the same time. Many people are crazy about it because it's a perfect party food. You might find it decorated with nuts or colorful dried fruits. Making it is a real labor of love, as cutting and frying all those little dough pieces takes time. But it was a way to make a big, impressive-looking dessert from very simple ingredients like flour, eggs, and honey. Choc Choc is a celebration of simple, rustic sweetness. But what if you had a bunch of apples and some stale bread? The Soviets had a delicious solution for that too, and it's called Charlotte. 5. Charlotte. When you hear the name Charlotte, you might think of a fancy French dessert. And you'd be partly right. The original Charlotte was a very complicated dish made with ladyfingers and custard. But the Soviet version, sometimes called Charlotka, is much simpler and in many ways much more comforting. It's basically an apple cake, but it's one of the easiest and most forgiving cakes you could ever make. It was the perfect way to use up the bounty of apples that came from country houses or dachas in the fall. The batter is super simple. Usually just eggs, sugar, and flour. There is often no butter or oil in it at all. The eggs are beaten with sugar until they are pale and thick, which gives the cake its light and spongy texture. You then just slice up some tart apples, toss them in a baking pan, and pour the simple batter right over the top. As it bakes, the cake puffs up around the apples, and the apples become soft and juicy, releasing their flavor into the sponge. The top gets a lovely golden crust, while the inside stays moist and tender. It was a dessert that any home cook could whip up in no time, and it filled the whole house with the warm smell of baked apples and cinnamon. It was the ultimate comfort food, turning simple apples into a warm, delicious cake. The next treat also features fruit, but in a much more surprising and elegant way, combining dried plums with the richness of dark chocolate. 6. Chocolate-covered prunes. This might sound almost too simple to be a real dessert, but chocolate-covered prunes were a beloved and surprisingly fancy treat. In the Soviet Union, fresh fruit could be hard to get, especially in the long, cold winters. But dried fruits like prunes were available all year round, and chocolate, while not always easy to find, was a treasured ingredient. Combining the two was a stroke of genius. These weren't just any prunes, though. To make them extra special, the prunes would often be stuffed before being dipped in chocolate. The most common filling was a single walnut or a piece of an almond tucked inside where the pit used to be. This added a wonderful crunchy texture to contrast with the soft, chewy prune and the smooth, hard chocolate shell. The flavor combination is amazing. You get the deep, dark fruitiness of the prune, the rich bitterness of the dark chocolate, and the earthy crunch of the nut. They were sold in fancy boxes and were often given as a gift. To put it mildly, getting a box of these was a big deal. They were like gourmet chocolates, a little bite of pure luxury. These simple yet elegant bites were a real treat, but not all Soviet sweets were meant to be eaten with a fork or your fingers. The next one is a creamy, frothy drink that doubled as a dessert and a cold remedy. 7. Gogol Mogul. This is the Soviet version of eggnog, but it's much simpler and often served warm. Gogol Mogul has a funny name and a history that's a mix of fact and fiction. The basic recipe is just egg yolks beaten with sugar until they become a thick, pale, ribbony cream. You can then add things like warm milk, a little honey, or a pinch of cocoa powder or vanilla. It's a rich, sweet, and comforting drink that feels like a hug in a mug. The thing nobody tells you is that it was also considered a type of medicine. If you had a sore throat or a cough, your babushka would likely whip you up a warm gogol-mogol. The warm, creamy mixture was believed to soothe a scratchy throat. In fact, many famous singers and actors in Russia swore by it as a secret weapon to keep their voices in top shape. The name itself is a mystery. One story says it was invented by a cantor in a synagogue who lost his voice and came up with this drink to heal it. Another story connects it to a writer named Nikolai Gogol. Whatever its true origin, it was a staple for kids and adults alike, a delicious way to get some energy and feel better. From a soothing drink, we move to a dessert that's all about crunch. These are light, airy, and delicate pastries that shatter in your mouth, and their name means twigs. 8. Kvorost means brushwood or twigs in Russian, and when you see these cookies, the name makes perfect sense. They look like a pile of delicate, tangled branches. They are a type of fried pastry known in other parts of the world as angel wings or funnel cake. The dough is very simple, usually made with flour, eggs, a little sugar, and often a splash of something strong like vodka or brandy. The alcohol isn't there to make you tipsy. It evaporates during frying and helps make the pastries incredibly light and crispy by preventing them from absorbing too much oil. The dough is rolled out paper thin and then cut into strips or ribbons. Often, a slit is cut in the middle of a strip, and one end is looped through to create a twisted bow shape. These delicate shapes are then quickly deep fried until they are a pale golden color. They cook in just a few seconds. Once they are pulled from the hot oil and drained, they are dusted generously with powdered sugar. They are so light they practically float, and they have a satisfying crunch that dissolves in your mouth. They were a fun and cheap way to make a big plate of treats for a crowd. These crispy twigs were a delightful and simple pleasure. But the next dessert on our list is anything but simple. It's a porridge, but a porridge so fancy it was served to the Russian czars. 9. Guryev porridge. A porridge for dessert? It sounds strange, but Guryev porridge is no ordinary breakfast oatmeal. This is a dessert of pure, over-the-top indulgence. It was invented in the early 19th century and named after Count Guryev, a minister of finance who fell in love with it at a dinner party. The base of the dish is semolina, which is cooked slowly in milk. But that's just the beginning. The real secret to Guryev porridge is the creamy skins. Milk is baked in a shallow dish in the oven until a golden brown skin forms on top. This skin is carefully removed and set aside. This process is repeated over and over again. The cooked semolina is then layered in a dish with these creamy milk skins, along with candied fruits, chopped nuts like walnuts and almonds, and spoonfuls of rich berry jam. The whole thing is then baked until it's warm and bubbly. It's served warm, often with more fresh fruit or jam on top. It's creamy, sweet, nutty, and fruity all at once. What many overlooked is that this was a way of showing off wealth and status. In the 1970s, it was a rare, old-fashioned treat that a family might make for a very special holiday, a taste of history. From a porridge for a king, we go to a humble loaf cake that was a staple in every Soviet kitchen, a simple fruitcake known simply as keks. 10. Keks. The word keks is just the Russian word for cake, but it refers to a very specific type of cake. It's essentially the Soviet version of a fruitcake or a pound cake. It's a dense, buttery loaf cake that is usually studded with raisins, nuts, or other dried and candied fruits. Every family had their own recipe for keks. Some were plain and vanilla flavored, while others were spiced with cinnamon or had a hint of citrus zest. A very popular version was the Stolichny keks, which means capital city cake. It was famous for having a huge amount of raisins, almost as many raisins as there was cake batter. The batter itself was usually rich and simple, made with butter, sugar, eggs, and flour. The thing that made it so popular was its long shelf life. Because it was so dense and often made with dried fruit, a Keks could last for a week or more without going stale, which was very practical. It was the perfect thing to have on hand for when guests dropped by unexpectedly. You could just slice it up and serve it with a cup of hot tea. It wasn't the fanciest dessert, but it was reliable, comforting, and delicious. You could find it in every state-run bakery and cafeteria. This humble loaf was a dependable treat. But if you wanted a cookie with a bit more spice and a lot more history, you would reach for a pryaniki. 11. Pryaniki are one of the oldest Russian sweets with a history going back over 1,000 years. They are often called Russian gingerbread, but that doesn't quite do them justice. The name comes from the Russian word for spices, and that's what they are all about. The dough is made with flour and honey and is heavily spiced with things like cinnamon, nutmeg, ginger, cloves, and cardamom. This gives them a wonderfully warm and fragrant flavor. By the 1970s, there were many different kinds of pryaniki. Some were small, round and soft, with a shiny sugar glaze on top. Others were larger and stamped with intricate designs using special wooden molds. A very famous type from the city of Tula was a large rectangular pryanik that had a thick layer of fruit jam or boiled condensed milk hidden inside. These were almost like a cookie and a pie, all in one. You see, these weren't just cookies. They were a part of the culture. They were given as gifts for weddings, holidays, and birthdays. Some were even made to be decorative, like edible works of art. They were a taste of old Russia that survived and thrived in the Soviet era. From ancient spiced cookies, we move to a modern dessert with a funny name that looks like a little mountain of delicious rubble, the anthill cake. 12. Muravenik. This cake's name means anthill, and that's exactly what it looks like. Muravenik is a no-bake cake that was incredibly popular because it was easy to make and used very common ingredients. To make it, you first bake a simple, crumbly, shortbread-style cookie dough. Then the real fun begins. You break up the baked cookies into small crumbs and pieces. Some people would even pass the cookies through a meat grinder to get the perfect texture. Then you mix all those cookie crumbs with a super sweet and sticky glue. This was almost always a mixture of softened butter and a can of boiled condensed milk, known as varyonaya skushenka. This caramel-like, thick and creamy and creamy sauce holds all the crumbs together. The whole sticky mess is then molded into a cone or dome shape on a plate, just like an anthill. To complete the look, it was often sprinkled with poppy seeds, which looked like little ants crawling all over the cake. It's a wonderfully crunchy, chewy, sweet, and caramelly dessert. It required no special baking skills and was a favorite for kids' birthday parties. The anthill cake was a fun and clever creation. Our next sweet is also simple, but has an elegant cloud-like texture and a delicate fruit flavor. It's called zephyr. 13. Zephyr. If a marshmallow and a meringue had a baby, it would be Zephyr. This beautiful and delicate sweet is named after Zephyrus, the Greek god of the west wind, which gives you a hint about how light and airy it is. It's made from a puree of fruit, usually apples, mixed with sugar and egg whites. This mixture is whipped for a long time until it's incredibly fluffy and thick. A gelling agent, like pectin or agar-agar, is added to help it set. The fluffy mixture is then piped into pretty shell-like shapes and left to dry out for a day or two. The result is a soft, slightly chewy confection with a thin, crisp shell on the outside. It has a wonderful, intense fruit flavor and is much less rubbery than a typical marshmallow. You could find them in flavors like apple, blackcurrant, or strawberry. Sometimes two pieces would be sandwiched together. To make them even more special, they were sometimes dipped in chocolate. What's amazing is that they are practically fat-free, made almost entirely of fruit, egg whites, and sugar. They were seen as a healthier sweet option and were loved by both children and adults. These airy fruit clouds were a sophisticated treat. But for a truly grand occasion, you needed a cake with a name. That means royal, the Korolevsky cake. 14. Korolevsky. The Korolevsky cake, or royal cake, sounds very fancy, and it lives up to its name. It's a rich and complex layer cake that has a little bit of everything. It's not one single recipe, but more of a style of cake with many variations. However, the most classic version features 3 different and distinct cake layers. One layer might be a plain sponge. Another layer might have poppy seeds mixed into the batter, giving it a unique texture and flavor. And the third layer would often have chopped nuts, like walnuts, baked right in. These 3 different layers would then be stacked together with a rich and creamy custard or a buttercream frosting. So, with every bite, you get a different combination of flavors and textures. It could be soft and spongy, then slightly crunchy from the poppy seeds, and then nutty from the walnut layer. To put it mildly, it was a cake designed to impress. It took a lot of effort to make, so it was reserved for the biggest celebrations like a major anniversary or a wedding. It was a true showstopper dessert. The royal cake was a masterpiece of textures, but sometimes the simplest desserts are the most comforting. The next treat uses the humble apple and turns it into a warm, gooey, and delicious personal dessert. 15. Peczenie jabłkowe. Peczenie jabłkowe simply means baked apples, and this was a dessert that was as healthy as it was delicious. It was another fantastic way to use the abundance of apples available in the autumn. The preparation couldn't be simpler. You take a whole apple, usually a tart variety like Antonovka, and you core it, making sure not to cut all the way through the bottom. This creates a little cup in the middle of the apple. This cup is then filled with all sorts of delicious things. The most common filling was a mixture of walnuts, raisins, a little bit of sugar, and a pinch of cinnamon. Sometimes a spoonful of honey or a small pat of butter would be added on top. The stuffed apples were then placed in a baking dish with a little water at the bottom and baked in the oven until they were soft, tender, and slightly wrinkly. The filling would become a warm, gooey, and fragrant center, and the apple itself would be so soft you could eat it with a spoon. It was a warm, comforting, and guilt-free dessert that filled the kitchen with the most amazing aroma. From a simple baked apple, we turn to a dish that could be breakfast, lunch, or a sweet dessert. The incredibly versatile cheese pancakes known as syrniki. 16. Syrniki are a beloved comfort food, and their magic comes from their main ingredient, a type of farmer's cheese called tvorog. Tvorog is a bit like cottage cheese or ricotta, but it's drier and more crumbly. To make syrniki, this cheese is mixed with a little flour, an egg, and a touch of sugar to bind it together. The mixture is then formed into small, thick patties, which are pan-fried in butter until they are golden brown and crispy on the outside. The inside, however, stays wonderfully soft, warm, and creamy, almost like a little cheesecake. While they can be eaten plain for breakfast, they are transformed into a dessert when they are served hot with a variety of sweet toppings. The most popular toppings were a big dollop of sour cream, a spoonful of berry jam, or a drizzle of honey. Sometimes raisins or other dried fruits would be mixed right into the batter. The combination of the warm, slightly tangy cheese pancake with the cool, creamy sour cream and sweet jam is absolutely irresistible. They are quick to make and were a staple in every household. These cheese pancakes were a creamy delight. The next dessert is also made from fruit, but it has a unique texture that is like a chewy, solid fruit foam, a very old sweet called pastila. 17. Pastila. Pastila is an ancient Russian confection that is often compared to fruit leather, but it's so much more than that. The traditional method of making it is very similar to making zefir. It starts with a sour apple puree that is mixed with sugar and egg whites. This mixture is whipped until it is white and airy, but instead of being piped into small shapes, this foam is spread into thin layers on trays and then baked in a very low-temperature oven for many, many hours. This slow drying process gives it a unique texture. It's not hard or sticky like fruit leather. Instead, it's soft, spongy, and a little bit chewy with a wonderful concentrated apple flavor. After drying, the sheets are often layered on top of each other and cut into squares or rectangles. It tastes like the pure essence of apples. By the 1970s, factory-made pastila was common, but many people still made it at home, especially if they had a lot of apples. It was another way of preserving the fruit harvest and creating a sweet treat that would last through the winter. From a chewy fruit paste, we come to a cake that shares a name with our very first dessert, but is a completely different creation, the other kind of bird's milk cake. 18. Bird's milk cake, jelly version. Wait a minute, didn't we already talk about bird's milk cake? Yes, but not all things are what they seem. While the famous patented cake was a souffle, many home cooks made a different, much simpler version that was also called bird's milk cake. This version was a no-bake dessert that had a texture more like a firm jelly or a very dense panna cotta. It was a beloved homemade alternative to the hard-to-get original. This cake was usually made with milk, sugar, butter, and a gelling agent, often gelatin or semolina. The semolina, when cooked with milk and then whipped with butter and sugar, creates a surprisingly light and creamy base that sets up firmly when chilled. This creamy white layer would be poured over a simple cookie or biscuit crust and then chilled until firm. The final touch was a layer of chocolate glaze on top. It was much easier to make than the complicated souffle version, and it was a favorite for family gatherings and potlucks. It was a perfect example of Soviet ingenuity, taking a famous, luxurious idea and creating a simple, accessible version for everyone to enjoy. This clever homemade version was a testament to home bakers. But if you wanted a cake with flaky layers and creamy custard, there was only one choice: the mighty Napoleon. 19. Napoleon cake. The Napoleon cake is the Russian and Soviet version of the French dessert known as millefeuille, which means 1,000 sheets, and that name is very fitting. The Napoleon is a magnificent cake made of many, many thin layers of flaky puff pastry. Making puff pastry from scratch is a huge amount of work, involving lots of folding and rolling with butter. But many Soviet cooks had clever shortcuts, using things like sour cream or even beer in the dough to make it flaky. Between each crispy layer of pastry is a generous spread of sweet, creamy custard known as zavarnoy creme. The cake is assembled by stacking these layers, sometimes up to 15 of them. After the cake is built, the sides and top are also covered in the cream. The final brilliant touch is to take the scraps and trimmings from the puff pastry, bake them until they are extra crispy, and then crush them into crumbs. These crumbs are then pressed all over the outside of the cake. This gives it a rustic look and an amazing crunchy texture. The cake needs to sit in the refrigerator for at least a day to allow the crispy layers to soften just enough to be cut easily, while the outside stays wonderfully crunchy. The Napoleon was a masterpiece of layers. For our final dessert, we're going small, with delightful little cookies shaped like nuts, but with a surprise sweet filling inside. 20. Oreshki means little nuts, and these cookies are one of the most nostalgic treats for anyone who grew up in the Soviet Union. They are little shortbread cookies that are baked in a special pan that looks like a waffle iron but has molds shaped like walnut halves. This special pan, called an oreshnica, was a prized possession in many kitchens. You would place small balls of dough into the molds, close the pan, and cook it over the stove, flipping it to cook both sides. This would create dozens of hollow, shell-like cookie halves that looked just like the outside of a walnut. But the real magic was the filling. The hollow shells were filled with that same delicious caramel-like boiled condensed milk we saw in the anthill cake. Sometimes finely chopped walnuts were mixed into the filling for extra crunch. After each half was filled, two halves were pressed together to create a whole nut. The result was a cookie that was crispy and buttery on the outside with a sweet, gooey, and decadent caramel filling on the inside. They were a bit of work to make, but a big plate of oreshki would disappear in minutes at any party. They were the perfect bite-sized taste of home. Size taste of home. Size taste of home. Size taste of home.